He bought an old house for next to nothing. But when he started tearing down a wall, he found a box that had been hidden for decades. What was inside changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The northern town where Andrew Miller had chosen to buy his plot of land was quiet in the way only forgotten places could be. Streets stretched between rows of houses that seemed older than the trees shading them, and in the early mornings, fog rolled across the cracked sidewalks as though reluctant to leave. The town was small enough that everyone knew the outlines of everyone else's business, but it was also large enough to let the ruins of time stand unattended. On one of these tired streets stood the house that Andrew had taken into his possession. To the casual eye, it was barely standing at all. The roof sagged unevenly, shingles warped and curling like pages left too close to fire. The paint, once a hopeful white, had long surrendered to the weather and now clung in thin strips, revealing the gray skeleton of wood beneath. Windows leaned in their frames as though exhausted by decades of storms, and the porch steps tilted forward, half buried in weeds. For most people, the structure would have been nothing but a burden, a relic too expensive to save and too frail to live in. But to Andrew, it represented a beginning. He had spent years in rented apartments where nothing was truly his, where every nail hammered into a wall carried the threat of a landlord's complaint. He had endured one move after another, his belongings packed and unpacked until they lost the smell of permanence. All the while he had promised himself that one day he would claim a space not borrowed, but built, a home that could hold the laughter of his wife and children without the fear of eviction. When the chance came to purchase this ruined property for almost nothing, he took it with the determination of a man who could not let opportunity slip away. Yet he was no fool. He knew this house could not be revived. The beams inside were eaten by rot, the floorboards buckled with damp, and the walls leaned at angles that spoke of collapse. Repair would be like pouring life into a corpse, and Andrew did not have the wealth to attempt miracles. His choice was clear. The house had to come down. He would clear the land, strip away the brittle shell of someone else's past, and raise in its place a new dwelling worthy of his family's future. In his mind, he could already see the lines of it. Straight walls gleaming in the sun, strong windows that kept the weather at bay, rooms filled with light. The act of demolition was not destruction to him, but liberation, the clearing away of shadows so that something living could be born. He spent days preparing for the task, walking the perimeter of the house, making lists on yellow pads of what equipment he would need. The decision to hire a professional crew tempted him, but he pushed it aside. Money was scarce, and his hands were strong. He rented the tools instead: a sledgehammer, a crowbar, saws for wood and steel, and a modest set of scaffolds. The equipment arrived in a truck that rumbled heavily down the quiet street, startling the neighbors into peeking through curtains. He unloaded each item with the care of someone arranging instruments before a symphony. Inside, the house smelled of dust layered upon dust, the scent of plaster and damp wood mixing into something both bitter and heavy. Andrew walked through the narrow hallway, listening to the groan of the floor beneath his boots, the sound of age compressed into every step. He touched the peeling wallpaper, the patterns of faded flowers dissolving into gray blotches, and imagined the hands that had pasted it decades before. For a moment, he felt almost guilty. He was not merely dismantling walls, he was erasing years of lives lived inside them. But then he reminded himself that the house was not fit for the living. His family deserved something better, and guilt could not stand in the way of necessity. When the day finally came to begin, he woke before dawn. His wife and children were still sleeping, and the silence of the house they rented for the moment pressed around him. He packed a thermos of coffee, pulled on thick gloves, and drove to the site. The sky was pale with the first light, and dew sparkled across the weeds that had claimed the yard. Standing in front of the house, tools laid out at his side, he felt the weight of history and anticipation collide. Here was the threshold between two lives, the one he had endured and the one he meant to build. The first swing of the hammer landed against the roofline. The crack echoed like a shot, startling birds from the eaves. Wood splintered, and dust ups in a cloud that shimmered in the light. Andrew swung again and again, each strike tearing away a piece of the past. The shingles tumbled, the rafters moaned, and slowly the top of the house gave way. He worked with the stubborn rhythm of a man determined not to pause, sweat dripping into his eyes, arms trembling but unwilling to stop. With every crash of debris, he felt the strange sensation of peeling away years, as though the house resisted and pleaded even as it fell. By noon, the roof sagged inward, like a chest caving under weight. He stepped back, breathing hard, his shirt clinging to him. The street was quieter than ever, only the faint hum of distant traffic breaking the stillness. The house looked wounded, exposed, and he could not help but feel the solemnity of the act. He told himself it was only timber and stone, but in the silence between swings, he felt as though unseen eyes were watching. He moved next to the upper rooms, prying boards from their frames, knocking down walls that crumbled too easily. Wallpaper flaked into the air like ash, and once bright paint peeled away in chunks. Behind one wall he found an old photograph fallen between the studs, its image almost gone, just a blur of faces that time had devoured. He tucked it away without knowing why, a small token of the lives that had lingered there. The day stretched long, and by evening he had stripped much of the upper floor. Debris littered the yard in uneven piles, splinters catching the low sun. He packed his tools and sat for a while on the steps, staring at the ruin he had created. The house was half alive, half gone, a skeleton waiting for its final blows. Despite exhaustion, he felt an odd sense of victory. He was dismantling history, yes, but he was also carving space for his own. Yet even in his pride, something unsettled him. One wall on the ground floor remained untouched, and though he told himself it could wait, his eyes kept returning to it. It was thicker than the others, built of heavy brick rather than wood and plaster, as though its builders had meant it to endure more than storms. He ran his hand across its rough surface, feeling the cool grit beneath his glove. The rest of the house surrendered easily to his blows, but this wall seemed to promise resistance. When he finally locked the site for the night and walked away, the image of that wall lingered. It stood like a sentinel among the ruins, mute and steadfast. Andrew told himself it was only architecture, a quirk of design. Still, as the twilight deepened around the broken house, he felt the faint stirring of something else, a whisper of mystery waiting behind the bricks. He shook it off as tired fancy, but the thought followed him home, settling in his mind like dust that refused to be brushed away. The first day had ended, and with it, the certainty that tearing down the house would be simple. The work ahead would be long, but already he sensed that what he was destroying was more than timber, nails, and mortar. Something within the house seemed to watch as he swung his hammer, and though he had not yet uncovered its secret, the presence of that heavy wall promised that the past wasn't done speaking. Morning returned to the ruined house, with a stillness that seemed deeper than the day before. The roof had been torn open, the upper rooms reduced to sagging bones, and yet the house remained upright, clinging to the ground as though unwilling to release its hold. Andrew stood in the yard, gloves pulled tight around his hands, his muscles sore from the previous day. He sipped his coffee and looked at the piles of splintered wood and broken shingles scattered across the lawn. then let his gaze settle once again on the wall in the center of the ground floor. It loomed in the dim interior light, dark with age, built of brick rather than the flimsy boards that had given way so easily. The night had not erased his unease about it. If anything, sleep had deepened it, filling his dreams with strange images of walls that whispered and shadows that would not move. Determined to silence such thoughts, he carried his tools inside. Dust lay thick on the floor, disturbed only by the path he had walked yesterday, and the air smelled of damp plaster and wood rot. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the ruined roof, catching on the haze of floating particles so that the room seemed to shimmer faintly. The wall stood at the far side of the space, waiting. Andrew lifted the hammer, positioned himself, and struck. The blow rang out with a sound unlike the others. Where yesterday's strikes had met with the dull crumble of plaster and splintering wood, this one echoed sharp and hollow, reverberating through the room like the chime of metal struck in a cavern. Andrew paused, heart thudding. He swung again, harder this time. The wall shuddered, flakes of mortar falling, and once again the hollow sound answered. His breath caught. Something was behind those bricks, something more than empty space. He leaned close, running a hand across the surface. The bricks here were newer than the others, their mortar darker, as though they had been placed deliberately after the house had already been built. For a moment, he wondered if it was a structural reinforcement, a simple attempt by long-ago owners to strengthen the frame. But the more he studied it, the less it looked like reinforcement, and the more it resembled concealment. Gripping the hammer again, he began to work at the mortar, chipping carefully rather than striking with force. Bits of gray dust rained down, coating his gloves. The bricks loosened one by one, reluctant to give way after decades of silence. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the hours passed, and with each brick removed, the sense of anticipation grew heavier. Finally, with a last tug, a section of the wall collapsed inward, and beyond it, a dark cavity appeared. Andrew crouched low, shining a flashlight into the narrow space. The beam of light caught the edges of something rectangular, wedged tightly into the hollow. He pushed his hand inside, fingers brushing against rough, splintered wood. A box. Large, heavy, its corners rusted with old nails. His pulse quickened. He pulled at it, the object resisting as though the wall itself clung to it. But at last it shifted free and slid onto the dusty floor with a dull thud. For a long moment he simply stared. The box was no ordinary crate. Though stained black with age, its construction was careful, the boards thick, the iron hinges broad, though rusted. The lid bore cracks like veins, but it was intact. He rested his hand on it, feeling the chill seeping through his gloves, and a strange reverence held him still. It was as though he had unearthed a relic, not of stone or gold, but of memory. At last he pried the lid open with the claw of his hammer. The wood resisted, groaning, then snapped apart with a sharp crack. A rush of stale air escaped, musty and sour, heavy with the scent of damp paper and time. Dust billowed upward, making him cough. He waved it away and leaned over the box. Inside lay bundles wrapped in yellowed newspaper. The print was faded, but the bold headlines that could still be made out spoke of banks collapsing, bread lines forming, families evicted. The dates were early in the 1930s, and the ink had bled where dampness had touched it. Beneath these bundles were coins, dozens upon dozens of them, stacked and scattered across the bottom of the box. Silver dollars gleamed faintly under the dust, their surfaces tarnished but unmistakable. Copper pennies and nickels lay among them, dull with age. Andrew lifted one between his fingers. It was heavier than the coins he knew, worn smooth at the edges by countless hands, yet still proud with the faint imprint of an eagle. His hands trembled as he sifted through the contents. Beneath the coins lay photographs, their corners curled, their surfaces spotted. He held one up to the light. A man stood stiffly in the center, his face stern, his shoulders broad. A woman leaned close beside him, her eyes tired but gentle, a faint smile forced across her lips. 2 children sat at their feet, their expressions solemn, as though laughter had been pressed from them. The background was familiar, the very porch Andrew had torn down yesterday. The boards younger and straight, the paint still bright. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, was a single line. For the days when hope returns. The words struck him with the force of a blow. This was no hidden treasure meant to enrich a stranger. This was desperation preserved. These coins were not the idle hoard of a miser. They were the lifeline of a family struggling to survive when the world had collapsed around them. The box was their shield, their prayer, their faith that the future would one day be kinder. Andrew replaced the photograph carefully, then lifted another. In this one, the children stood alone, their hands clasped tightly together, eyes gazing directly into the lens. He felt a chill run down his spine. It was as though they looked at him across time, silently pleading not to be forgotten. His throat tightened, and he placed the photo back with trembling care. Around him, the ruined house was silent, the air heavy as if holding its breath. The beams groaned faintly, dust shifted in the corners, but otherwise, the world seemed to pause. He realized that he was no longer simply demolishing walls. He had cracked open a story sealed away for nearly a century, one that had waited for his hands to reveal it. He sat back on his heels, staring at the box. The coins glinted faintly in the dim light. The photographs stared up from their fragile frames. The newspapers whispered of collapse and despair. He felt the weight of their history pressing upon him, mingling with his own burdens. He had come to this place to destroy and rebuild, to make something new from ruin. But now he saw that the ruin had never been empty. It was filled with voices that had been silenced, with hope buried beneath brick and mortar. As twilight fell, Andrew gathered the box in his arms and carried it outside. The yard lay quiet, the piles of debris long shadows in the fading light. He set the box down on the porch steps that still clung stubbornly to the frame of the house and lowered himself beside it. The cicadas had begun their evening chorus, and the cool air carried the scent of cut grass from a neighbor's yard. He pressed his hands together, resting his forehead against them, trying to steady the storm of thoughts. This discovery was not what he had expected. He had imagined demolition as a straightforward path toward progress, a clearing away of obstacles so that something new could rise. But progress had unearthed the past, and the past refused to be silent. The coins, the photographs, the faded ink on the back of the picture, they had transformed the house from ruin into testimony. He could not look at it the same way again. That night, when he finally returned home, his wife noticed the tension in his face, but he said little. He lay awake long after the house was quiet, his mind replaying the moment the lid snapped open, the first glimpse of silver and paper, the solemn faces staring back at him. Sleep eluded him, and when dreams did come, they were filled with images of children waiting at a doorway, clutching coins in their small hands, watching him with eyes too old for their years. When dawn broke, he was already awake. He rose quietly, dressed, and returned to the site. The house waited as it had before, broken but not defeated, its heavy wall now a gaping cavity where the box had been. He stood in the yard, the mist damp against his skin, and realized that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a man tearing down a house to build another. He was a witness to a history he had never expected to inherit, and its weight had settled into his bones. The day ahead promised more labor, more sweat and noise and rubble. But even as he lifted the hammer once more, Andrew knew the work had changed. Each strike would carry not only the force of demolition, but the echo of what he had uncovered. The box, the coins, the photographs, they had bound him to the house in ways he did not yet understand. He could not walk away from it, not now. The secret behind the wall had spoken, and he would have to listen. The following morning arrived gray and heavy, as though the sky itself shared in the weight that pressed on Andrew's shoulders. He had slept only in fragments, his mind restless with the images of the photographs and the brittle newspaper clippings he had found inside the hidden box. When the first pale light slipped through the blinds, he rose quietly, his body aching from both labor and unease. The memory of the hollow sound behind the wall, the crumbling mortar, the sight of the wooden chest wedged in the cavity, all of it returned with the sharpness of something unfinished. He had not expected to feel so unsettled, yet he could not shake the presence of the family whose lives he had touched by uncovering their secret. At the demolition site, the house looked even more fragile than before. The gutted walls leaned inward, the roof sagged under the weight of absence, and the gaping hollow where the box had been pulled free resembled a wound in the body of the home. Andrew walked across the debris, boots crunching over shattered plaster, his gaze fixed on the cavity. It seemed emptier now, stripped not just of bricks, but of meaning. The house had relinquished something vital, and in doing so had become only ruin. He set the box carefully on what remained of the porch and opened it once again. The coins gleamed faintly in the morning light, their tarnished surfaces catching the sun in dull flashes. He sifted through them slowly, listening to the soft clink of metal, aware that each sound represented not fortune, but survival. These were not riches hidden for greed. They were meals, shelter, hope squeezed into solid form. Beneath the coins, the photographs stared back at him, faces frozen in an era of despair. He lifted one again, the image of the two children holding hands, and studied their solemn eyes. He saw in them not only fear, but determination, a stubborn refusal to surrender, even as the world collapsed around them. The thought struck him that he could not let these lives slip back into silence. It was not enough to marvel at the discovery or to keep it hidden in his own possession. The box had chosen him, in a way, to carry the story forward. Yet to do so, he needed to understand more. Who had these people been? Why had they vanished without reclaiming what mattered so deeply to them? What had become of their hope? These questions pressed on him until he felt compelled to seek answers. That afternoon, he drove into town, the box resting safely in the trunk of his car. The library stood at the edge of the square, a red-bricked building with tall windows clouded by decades of dust. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and polish, the kind of place where voices naturally lowered to whispers. He approached the desk, where an elderly librarian looked up with eyes sharpened by years of cataloging memory. When he explained that he was searching for records of a family who had lived at his address nearly a century ago, she nodded slowly and directed him to the archives upstairs. Hours passed as Andrew pored over ledgers, census documents, and fragile rolls of microfilm. His eyes burned from the flicker of projected images, but he pressed on with the stubborn persistence that had always carried him through. At last, a surname surfaced in the records, faintly familiar from the scrawled ink on the back of the photograph. There they were, the father, listed as a worker at the local steel mill, the mother as homemaker, two children with ages that matched the faces he had seen. For a brief moment he felt triumph, as though he had touched their hands through the veil of time. But the story that followed was far from triumph. Tax records showed delinquency mounting year after year. Court filings hinted at foreclosure proceedings. By the mid-1930s, the family's name vanished from the documents altogether. No sale, no obituary, no trace of relocation. It was as though they had been swallowed whole by history, erased by poverty's merciless hand. Andrew closed the last ledger with trembling fingers, a hollow ache filling his chest. The silence in the records spoke louder than words. They had disappeared, not in triumph, but in desperation, leaving behind their coins and their photographs, sealed away with the promise of return. Driving home through the dusky streets, Andrew felt the enormity of what he had learned. The family had lived, struggled, and vanished, their memory buried with the collapsing economy that had broken so many. Yet their presence lingered in the objects he carried, tangible proof that they had existed, loved, and hoped. He thought of his own children, safe in their rented rooms, unaware of the storm their father carried inside him. He imagined what it would mean to vanish as that family had, leaving nothing but tokens for some future stranger to find. The thought chilled him. The days that followed were filled with restless energy. Andrew visited the courthouse, seeking more documents, but the trail remained thin. He spoke with neighbors, particularly the older ones who had lived in the town their whole lives. Most had no memory stretching back that far, but one man, bent with age and slow in speech, recalled hearing from his father about a family who had lost their farm during the Depression and tried to hold on in the house by the square. According to him, they had struggled bitterly before disappearing overnight. Whether they left to seek work elsewhere or were driven out, no one knew. What remained was only rumor and silence. The fragments troubled Andrew more than a complete story might have. He saw in his mind the father stacking coins into neat piles, the mother wrapping them in newspaper, the children watching with wide eyes, their small hands clutching one another for strength. He imagined the day they hid the box, placing it behind the wall with trembling hope that they would one day reclaim it. The wall had held that hope, brick by brick, through decades of silence, and now it had fallen into his hands, unasked for, but undeniable. At night he returned to the box, spreading its contents across the table in his temporary kitchen. The newspapers crackled under his touch, headlines of collapse and despair staring up at him with the stark language of crisis. Breadlines, jobless men, banks shuddered. He traced the faded ink with his finger, feeling the weight of history settle in his bones. The coins sat in quiet towers, tarnished yet proud. The photographs lay between them, silent witnesses with solemn eyes. He saw his own children's reflections in those faces, and the unease grew stronger. The parallel between their lives and his pressed in on him. He too carried the burden of providing, of ensuring that his family did not know the instability he had endured as a child. The mortgage on the new project was heavy, the labor exhausting, the uncertainty constant. What if he failed, as they had? What if his family too became a line that ended abruptly, remembered only by scraps of paper and forgotten coins? The thought gnawed at him, yet it also steeled his resolve. Perhaps their story could serve as a warning, a reminder of how fragile stability could be. Still, the question of what to do with the box haunted him. Legally, it was his. Anything buried within his property belonged to him, yet conscience resisted that notion. To spend the coins felt like theft from the dead. To hide them again felt like silencing voices that had finally been heard. He considered donating them and trusting the objects to a historical society, but even that seemed inadequate. They had not been meant for a display case. They had been meant for survival. One evening, unable to sleep, Andrew walked through the gutted rooms of the house once more. The moonlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, painting the walls in pale silver. He paused before the hollow where the box had been concealed, staring into its emptiness. He imagined the father laying the box within, brick after brick, sealing it away. Each strike of the trowel must have echoed with desperation, with the hope that one day those coins would carry the family into better days. That hope had never been fulfilled, and now it rested with him. As the night deepened, he realized that he could not treat the discovery as mere curiosity. It was a story entrusted to him by chance, but chance was enough. The family's silence demanded that someone speak for them. The box was not just an object, it was testimony. He could not build his future on their silence without honoring their struggle. The thought brought him no peace, but it did bring clarity. By the time dawn colored the horizon, Andrew had made up his mind. He would continue to search, to dig deeper, to bring their story into the light. He owed it not only to them, but to himself, to his children, to the idea that hope, no matter how fragile, mustn't be buried. And as he stood in the ruined yard, the debris of the old house scattered around him, he felt both the weight and the privilege of that duty. The house had spoken through its broken walls, and he had no choice but to listen. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of work and contemplation, the two threads twisting together until Andrew could no longer separate them. Each morning he rose with the sun, his body weary, but his mind sharpened by the questions that lingered from the discovery. The ruined house stood as both obstacle and companion. Its sagging beams and fractured walls demanded labor, while the silent weight of the box and its contents demanded thought. He carried both burdens together, each swing of the hammer breaking stone and stirring memory at once. The demolition progressed slowly. What remained of the roof came down in a storm of shingles and splinters. The walls collapsed one after another until only fragments of the frame still clung to the foundation. Dust hung thick in the air, settling on his clothes, clinging to his hair, filling his lungs with the taste of age. He had imagined demolition as a swift act of force, but it revealed itself instead as a process of patient unraveling, each piece of timber and brick surrendering reluctantly. And through it all, he remained mindful of the discovery, as though each fallen wall echoed the story of the family who had once placed their hopes within the house. When the last of the interior partitions lay in heaps on the floor, Andrew paused. The house was no longer a house at all, only rubble marking the outline of where lives had once unfolded. He stood amid the wreckage and tried to imagine it as it had been in the photograph. The father upright with his hand on the shoulder of his son, the mother's tired smile, the children clasping one another's hands. He imagined them moving through the very spaces he now reduced to ruin, their voices long faded, yet still alive in the creak of the floorboards and the sigh of the collapsing walls. The thought filled him with both sorrow and reverence. The box remained with him always. Some evenings, he spread its contents across the kitchen table, arranging the coins in careful towers, studying the brittle newspapers until the ink blurred before his eyes. The photographs he placed in a line, as though reconstructing a family portrait. Time had torn apart. Other evenings, he simply held the box closed, letting its presence speak for itself. It seemed to him less an object than a voice, one that whispered of hunger and endurance, of faith placed in better days that had never come. His wife watched him silently, understanding more through his quiet intensity than through words. The children, curious but too young to grasp the depth of what he had found, asked questions he answered gently. To them, it was a treasure box, filled with old coins and pictures. To Andrew, it was something greater, a burden and a gift, a reminder that the past did not lie still beneath the earth, but rose again when called. He knew he could not keep it to himself forever. To hide it away would be to repeat the silence that had already stretched across generations. And so one morning, he carried a selection of the photographs and coins to the Historical Society downtown. The modest building housed displays of farming tools, faded clothing, and letters preserved from earlier decades. He laid out the items before the curator, explaining how he had come upon them in the walls of the old house. The man's eyes widened, his hands hovering above the fragile papers as though touching them might disturb something sacred. He spoke of their value, not as wealth, but as windows into the town's forgotten past. Families like the one Andrew had uncovered had built the community, endured its darkest days, and vanished without their stories ever being told. To restore them to memory was to give the town back a piece of itself. Andrew agreed to leave several photographs and coins for preservation, though he kept some for himself. He felt it right that the town should remember, but he also felt a personal bond, too strong to sever completely. The box belonged to him now, not by law alone, but by the strange inheritance of chance. He was its caretaker, entrusted to carry forward what time had nearly erased. Returning home from the Historical Society, he felt lighter, though the weight of the past did not leave him. It had shifted, becoming less a burden and more a responsibility carried with pride. He looked at the ruins of the house with new eyes. They were not merely rubble waiting to be cleared. They were the closing chapter of one story and the prologue to another. His own family's future would rise from the same ground, and he knew now that it could not be divorced from what had come before. The work of clearing the site consumed the following weeks. He hauled away timber, loaded bricks into dumpsters, leveled the foundation until only bare earth remained. Each day he returned home exhausted, yet with the quiet satisfaction that came from shaping the ground beneath his feet. And when the last of the debris was gone, he stood in the open yard, gazing at the patch of earth where both ruin and memory had once stood. It was ready now for the new beginning he had promised himself. The construction of the new house began with the pouring of the foundation. Concrete trucks arrived, their engines rumbling like distant thunder, filling the forms that marked the outline of walls yet to be built. As the mixture spread and hardened, Andrew performed a quiet act of his own. From the box, he had taken several coins, tarnished and worn, and placed them into the wet concrete at the corner of the foundation. He pressed them gently beneath the surface, leaving no sign of them above, sealing them into the structure that would hold his family. It was his way of binding past to present, of ensuring that the hope buried once in desperation would now live on as strength. Day by day the house rose. Wooden beams climbed skyward, walls framed in clean lines, windows fitted to capture the sun. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the silence of ruin, and the scent of fresh timber pushed away the damp odor of rot. Andrew worked alongside the crew whenever he could, his muscles aching, but his spirit renewed. With each board nailed, each wall raised, he felt as though he were not merely building a house, but writing a continuation of a story that had been interrupted. When the roof was set and the siding nailed into place, he stood back to look. The house gleamed in the afternoon light, not yet finished, but already alive with possibility. His children ran through the empty rooms, their laughter filling the spaces with sound that seemed to cleanse them of silence. His wife stood in the doorway, her face soft with relief. For Andrew, it was more than pride. It was fulfillment of a vow. Where once he had torn down, now he had raised up. Where once hope had been buried, now it stood open to the sky. Inside, on a shelf in the living room, he placed the box. Not hidden, not buried, but visible, a reminder. He kept within it the remaining photographs and a few coins, showing them to his children one evening. He explained not their value in money, but their meaning. He told them of a family who had lived through hardship, who had saved and dreamed even when the world gave them little reason to. He spoke of the words written on the back of a photograph, for the days when hope returns. He told them that hope did not always come quickly, but it came to those who held on with courage. His children listened, their eyes wide, perhaps not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of his words. News of the discovery spread quietly through the town. Neighbors came to ask, and Andrew shared the story freely, always careful to place the honor on the family who had come before. Some neighbors offered fragments of memory, stories passed down from parents and grandparents, adding threads to the tapestry. The local newspaper printed a small article, and for a brief time Andrew's name was tied to the past, not just as a builder, but as a keeper of history. He accepted the attention humbly, redirecting it always to those whose coins and photographs had endured. As the months passed, and the house filled with furniture, with meals cooked and shared, with children's games echoing in the halls, Andrew felt a sense of belonging he had never known in his own childhood. The house was not merely walls and a roof. It was a vessel of memory, a monument to resilience. Each evening he sat on the new porch steps, the ones he had built with his own hands, listening to the voices of his family inside, and thought of the coins sealed into the foundation beneath him. They rested there like roots, anchoring the past to the present, whispering through the concrete that hope endures. On quiet nights, when the wind brushed against the shutters and the moonlight painted the yard, Andrew sometimes imagined the family from the photographs walking beside him. The father, weary yet determined. The mother, her eyes filled with both sorrow and tenderness. The children, solemn but unbroken. He imagined them watching his own children run across the lawn, their laughter rising into the night. And in those moments, he felt less like a man alone, and more like a link in a chain that stretched across time. The ruin had been cleared, but the past had not been erased. It had been woven into the present, carried forward into the future. Andrew knew that he had been chosen, however accidentally, to bear that story, to keep alive the voices that would otherwise have been lost. And as he stood on the steps of his new home, the cool breeze against his face, his children's laughter behind him, he knew that the promise written long ago had at last been fulfilled. Hope had returned, not only for him and his family, but for those who had once placed their faith in coins and photographs hidden behind a wall. Their story lived on, carried in the walls of the new house, in the memory of the town, and in the hearts of those who would not forget. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to explore our other videos for more incredible stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.